If this is your first time joining us, my name is Jocelyn Hurtado. I am the archivist at the Black Archives History and Research Foundation. And as part of our Safer Home virtual series, my segment is called Is It True? Tales from the Magic City. During this segment, I basically discuss different tales heard throughout time regarding the Magic City. And today's tale is it true that there was a black community, black neighborhoods in the area, what we know now as Brickell. And this actually came from one of our viewers, Mr. Oscar J. Braynon, and he's going to be joining us today because before this series started, I actually never heard this story, this piece of information, and it was really hard to find information, but I'm gonna bring him in to see where did he hear from, where did this come from. And if you give me a second, he's gonna join. In the meantime, I hope you guys are all doing well. All right. Okay. Okay. Mr. Braynon, I see that you're here in the comments. See if you can go up to when you first join, and can you send a request to join live? I tried to do it on my end, but didn't let me. So if you can please send me a request, and I can add you on to this chat. While we're waiting, I also just want to go over really quickly last week's episode where I talked about the pirate Black Caesar. I forgot to mention there's actually a pretty interesting read called the Black Caesar's Clan. It's a fictional story, and it basically just talk about the folklore related to Black Caesar's buried treasure. It involves like treasure hunters, old Florida, and everything like that. But what I really like about it, it doesn't really give you a good, it doesn't give you a viewpoint from a black Miamian, but what it does do is it gives you a good viewpoint how Miami was back in the early 1900s as far as scenery, landscape, and what the daily life kind of consisted of. All right, let me see. Mr. Braynon, I don't know if you heard me. I can add you on my end, but if you go to the top when you first came in, and if you can go up and send a request, I can add you to this chat. Give me 1 second. Let me see. It lets me. Okay, hey. Hi, Mr. Braynon.
How you doing?
Good, good, and you?
I'm doing fine, doing fine.
All right,
Okay, how's that?
Good, it's perfect, it's perfect.
Okay, thank you for having me.
No problem.
And you go ahead, I'll listen, and then when you want to hear the story, I'll tell you what I got.
Okay, but before I start, can you please introduce yourself? This is Mr. Oscar J. Braynon. I know him because he's a researcher of the archives, and he's also the husband of our chairwoman, Ms. Patricia J. Braynon. And I know them because of they're really into genealogy, and the Black Archives has started doing segments into genealogy. And so, we've known each other, but if you can please introduce yourself, I'll be greatly appreciated.
Well, thank you. My name is Oscar James Braynon, and genealogy is one of my hobbies and passions. I've, as far as my Florida family is concerned, I've researched and found that I've had family here since the 1800s, approximately 1880s. And the other side of the family, on my paternal grandfather's side, they arrived here in 1917 from the Bahamas. The paternal grandmother family arrived here in the 1880s.
Okay.
So I've kind of got a pioneer
You
roots
do,
of
you
in
do.
Miami.
Your family is Floridian as Miami as it can be.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
The group, the portion of my family that was here in the 1880s, how I found out about it was that I found a 1900 census with my great grandmother being 12 years old at the time, living in what the census says is Coconut Grove. And then I asked some stories around, and I found out that it wasn't just Coconut Grove. Everything south of the river was considered Coconut Grove. And
Okay.
in the
Yeah.
census, it shows that the family household was on the same street as the Brickells.
Yes, and I'm going to stop you right there so we
Okay.
can kind of set up today's episode. So if you didn't catch me earlier, today's episode is basically, is it true there was a Black community, a Black neighborhood in the area what we know as Brickell, which is today's one of the priciest areas, zip codes in Miami, filled with luxury condominiums, restaurants, hotels. And so we're going to be talking about that because people normally associated the Black neighborhoods in Miami either in Overtown or in, the Coconut Grove by Macedonia Church. But before we get started, I also want our viewers to know to kind of think geography and the landscape a little bit different than what we know as now because um, the we're going to start off the era that we're going to start off is going to be before the city of Miami was incorporated. Remember that the city of Miami was incorporated in 1896, but Miami-Dade County was established in 1836. And there were already a few settlers living here in this area, not many, but by the 1840s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, and 80s. And then by the 1890s, that's when you really start seeing that increase of population trends. So what I'm going to get started is so our viewers can know that Miami-Dade County, the original county line was actually included the area what we know now is as West Palm Beach, all the way down to the upper Florida Keys of what we know now as Bahia Honda. And that just included a very vast area. You know, it's like literally basically most of all of South Florida, what we know as now, including areas of the Everglades. And one of the earlier settlers, there were earlier settlers in this area during that time, especially during the Seminole Wars. A lot of indigenous people lived here, as well as a lot of slaves that ran away, and as well as a lot of immigrants from the Bahamas. And then you also have the Brickell family. A lot of people don't know, might not know why, this area near downtown is called Brickell, but that was actually because of a family that came to the area in the 1870s. And so they came into the area in the 1870s. And I want to also let people know that even though this was part of the Deep South, racial segregation wasn't as strict in the early 1870s, 80s, during that area. What I've read, it actually becomes more enforced after Henry Flagler gets here. And I don't know if you read almost the same thing as well.
You asking me?
Yes.
Yes, I think Flagler had to, what's the word, segregate Miami to make it plausible for the railroad to bring Northerners to the South to vacation, to live, and to work here. Prior to that, it was primarily pioneer country,
Yeah.
and people did what they could to get along. And sometimes that meant crossing racial lines or traditional racial barriers and mores of society. But once they brought the railroad, they brought the South and Jim Crow with them.
Yes, that's what I've been reading a lot about too, because you also had the Peacock family, which was a British family that lived into, what we like now typically think of the area of Coconut Grove, and you see a lot of Black Bahamians and a lot of white Bahamians just living coexisting together And I've read accounts that, they depended on each other to survive because this was no easy landscape. This was not an easy terrain to live. It was hot. There was a lot of mangroves. Vegetation was thick. So it's pretty interesting to kind of do a deep dive a little bit to like pre-Miami, the city of Miami history.
Yes, it is interesting how things changed once the railroad came, and how people kind of got along to some extent prior to that, and it was the railroad kind of brought the North to Miami.
Yes, it really did bring like Plessy versus Ferguson down. And today's segment came about by a comment that you left in one of my previous segments saying, hey, can you do, and is it true that a Black neighborhood existed in the area named as Brickell? And I never heard of this, but thanks to your deep dive into your family history, now we can start exploring a little bit more into that. So at this time, I'm going to ask you, what do you know about it? How did you first hear about, your family living in the same street as the Brickell, or what do you even know about the area?
Well, the area on the census is listed as Coconut Grove. It was not part of quote unquote city of Miami proper. It wasn't called Brickell because the Brickells hadn't named it yet. That came later. In my quest to research my family history, I found the census report of 1900 for that precinct. It was called Precinct 32, which was basically Coconut Grove, everything south of the river along the coast. When I found it, I didn't even notice the Brickells on the page at first. I was looking for my family. I found them, and happy. I didn't look at the rest of the page for probably a year. And then I went back to look at the page when I told some other family members about an older family member about the story. And he began to tell me the story that they worked for the Brickells and lived near the Brickells. And there was another story of going across the river and being chased back from the city of Miami. Oh. One of my grand aunts were chased out of the city of Miami across the river back to her house. And she was so traumatized for it, she didn't go outside for 2 weeks.
Oh my God.
But as far as what this, huh?
Do you know why was she chased?
Yeah, she was a Black girl and she wasn't supposed to be in downtown Miami, I guess, alone. And some white boys chased her back across the river and frightened her to the extent that she didn't come out the house for weeks.
Wow.
In the census report, there are 7 families listed on the same street as the Brickells. And in 1900, Mary Brickell was 64 years old and William Brickell was 75. He was still alive. And my family was probably about a third of the way down the page. My great grandmother was 12 years old. She had a brother that was a bit younger, and her mother was 35. Her stepfather, Lewis, was 32. And the last name was Kitt, K-I-T-T. His last name was Kitt. He apparently adopted Sarah's 2 children, Matilda and John. Matilda was listed as being born in Miami. So she's 12 years old in 1900. She was born in Miami in 1888. And her parents were listed as being born in South Carolina. So they moved here from South Carolina. Most of the Blacks in that page seem to be from Georgia or South Carolina. Not as many Bahamians as I really had thought, but most of them were from Georgia and South Carolina. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, this is a topic that really I'm gonna continue looking into this, and it's gonna require a lot of researching. And one of the tools that I know that we use to do research is looking at the census, and it's because I know you have access to it because of the Ancestry subscription, and so do I. through the Black archives. And if you ever seen these census records, you know, they can strain your eyes. It's like the handwriting is not as perfect, and it's something that you really have to have. Like every time you look at a new document, I would suggest go back to it a couple months later, because you're always going to notice something that you didn't before. And when you gave me this piece of information, I actually looked at the 1880s census records from Dade County at all. But I was able to find the 1880 census for Dade County. And I saw the Brickells there as well. And at that time, you know, the population was substantially less than what it was in the 1900s. And I saw that the Brickell and a lot of other families were in the area already, and that you do see you know, the Black settlers and the white settlers living side by side. And another thing I found interesting enough to note, that they actually took a couple census records of some of the indigenous people here in the area as well, which I never seen before, ever, like ever. And they actually spelled out the indigenous name, and they did the occupation, the age, everything. And a lot of the occupation, you see, you know, medicine man, agriculturalist, jewelry merchant, like tradesmen. And I thought like I was really excited, because I looked at census records a lot because of, you know, the Black archives and genealogy. And I found it really interesting that, you know, because of this conversation, you know, this led me to another piece of information that I didn't even know, you know, was available.
Yeah, that like I said, it was a year before I even found the Brickell's name on the same page. I looked at talking about occupations. My great grandmother's mother was listed as a cook, and her stepfather, I wasn't able to determine, because of the handwriting, whether he worked on a stove or at a store. Now, I want to think store, because I know the Brickells ran a general store on the river at the time, as well as a marina. So I'm not quite sure, and I'm going to have to keep researching that. But the handwriting is indecipherable from the census report. An additional document that I have that came from the newspaper, and I believe it was called it wasn't the Miami Herald at the time. I believe it was called the Miami Evening Record. And this is from February of 1904, detailing a transaction between Mary Brickell and L&S Kit in the classifieds, or the public records section. And apparently she sold them 2 lots on block 48, lots 4 and 5, for $80. Now, I noticed that some of the records said that people were taking out mortgages, or they had paid off a mortgage. This didn't indicate a mortgage, so apparently it was a cash transaction for the 2 lots. I can't verify it yet, but I believe these lots were near what's now Southwest 8th Street. Yeah. And I'm going to have to keep researching to find that. I took a walking tour with the Miami Heritage group.
Was it with Dr. Paul
Dade Heritage? Yes, Dade Heritage. And I found out that sometime between 1900 and 1910, the Brickells decided that they wanted to begin to sell the land in their community in big plots to attract white industrialists to move to South Florida. And maybe this is part of the railroad coming and Miami beginning to grow. Because of that, they decided apparently they didn't want blacks in the area. So I noticed by 1910, the family is no longer in Brickell. They're back in what I believe is Overtown, and eventually they move out to what we now call the Civic Center, which by 1920 is almost the swamps in Indian territory. But this, I've got to continue to do research on this land transaction and how long they stayed in that particular home in the Brickell area.
That doesn't surprise me because it actually kind of it sounds so similar to the railroad shop, another Black community, another Black neighborhood that was allocated for the colored residents of Miami, and then a couple years later, the residents were basically forced out. Have you heard anything? I know you can track your family through the census record that they were no longer there, but have you heard anything from older family members that kind of details, a little bit more information that, that more personal counts?
About the railroad shop?
No, about your family moving from, from that area.
From the Brickell area? No, I haven't heard anything else about it. I did find out that the Brickells wanted to sell the land and put big fancy houses on it. That eventually happened. And I know by 1910, my family wasn't there. And at $80, that's probably not what the Brickells were looking for on their waterfront property in 1910.
Yes, and for those who are not, later the Brickells will move now to what we know as Brickell Point, where the W Hotel is. But basically, that whole area, that tip area, that area, they all owned it. And at one point, they owned land from the Miami River all the way down, to Coconut Grove.
Mine it is.
And I also want to mention that when Mary Brickell passed away, I know you sent me this news article that basically says colored people mourn Miss Brickell's passing. I don't know if you want to read from it. Or
sure. Sure. Let me see if you have it, you can read it. I'll have to go through a couple documents, but you're welcome to read it. Okay,
yes. So I have it. So this is a newspaper that Mr. Braynon forwarded to me. It was published in the Miami Herald in 1922, and it basically says, colored people mourn Mrs. Brickell passing. The death of Mary Brickell, thought to be expected in the course of nature, is a distinct loss to this section of the Florida, in particular to the colored people of Miami, whom she became not only property holder, but better citizen. Her general query to them was not so much, what have you, but how are you living? Hence, while bowing to will of Providence, the colored people in Miami, along with others, feel her loss keenly. With sincere sympathy for the family, we are respectful. Signed, A. Stokes, W. A. Chapman. Let's see. J.R. Evans, J.R. Michaels, J.W. Johnson, Octavius Newbold, and J.W. Johnson.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, and I thought it was pretty interesting because there are some pretty recognizable names that, have such a big influence in the Black community in Miami. And that was pretty interesting. I also read that Mrs. Mary Brickell, she took over her husband's finance and property in the company after he passed away. And that it said that she never foreclosed on the home. So even if, let's say, the family couldn't pay for it, she wouldn't foreclose it. Like, I guess she worked out some kind of deal. And I guess, I imagine maybe that applied to both her, the tenants, Black and white.
Yeah, that, I want to see how the transaction happened, that the family moved from 8th Street to Overtown. I'm going to continue to do some research to see what happened between 1904 and 1910.
And I know it's getting close to time, but before we wrap this up, have you heard of other communities besides your family living in that area or working for the Brickells?
No, I haven't. I mean, I have a list on the census, but I haven't found anybody who is attached or related to these individuals on this list.
And I know we mentioned the railroad shop, but there's so many little small communities throughout Miami area that no longer exist, primarily Black community that eventually were first forced out. And I also heard of another area, not directly like adjacent to Coconut Grove, but it was called Sweetingtown. I don't know if you heard of it. I know a lot of members of the Sweeting family also lived in that area, but then they eventually moved to Overtown.
No, I haven't heard. This is the first I've heard of Sweeting Town.
Yeah.
I am very familiar with the railroad shop incident. I had about 4 sets of family relatives that were affected by that. And also another strange one I heard of was Seminole. I don't know if you've ever heard of that one.
Yes, yes, I've heard of Seminola, and I hope to do a future episode on it because the reason I love doing this is because these are neighborhoods that once existed. They're vibrant, they have stories to tell, and I want to make sure that people don't forget these stories. Basically doing the same thing that what you do with your family. You're tracing back the history and just letting people know this information. So when people say, what happened, we can give them a little bit more of a backstory. So so I have a question. It says, what happened with the railroad shop? So, I don't know if would you like to join me on this part of the
Sure,
conversation?
sure.
Okay. So I've been working on research on the railroad shop. Because of this topic, it's a little bit, I'm going to go over my time a little bit because it's such a fascinating history. And the railroad shop was a community that existed. Give me 1 second so I can quote the direct area. So give me 1 second. Okay. So what I'm going to read to you comes directly from the AT&T Miami-Dade African American calendar. We have the calendar housed in the Black Archives repository, and this information is available actually online. So if you go to www.balt.org, you can type in railroad shop in our search engine when you go to the archives finding a page, and you're going to be able to read a little bit more in depth about this community. So the railroad shop was a color addition, was a small close-knit Black community established in actually in the 1915s. The community extended from Northwest 12th Avenue to 17th Avenue, from 46th Street to 50th Street. Before I started doing research, I actually figured out why it was called the Railroad Shop Color Edition. It was because the advertisement that was published in the newspaper in 1915, it actually was advertised as Colored Railroad Shop Edition. It was basically saying because Colortown was becoming too overpopulated, they designated this area, which was the colored edition, so these colored citizens can go ahead and live in that area. And I actually want to read to you a advertisement that was published on the Miami News, August 9, 1915. It says, Railroad Shop Color Edition. Close to the city limits on the north, not far from the site for the FEC shops, the logical place to Color Town, especially as it's outside the city limits. A park set aside for the use of the lot owners. A site for an industrial school, prices as low as $35 a lot. Term is $3 down, $1 a week. Big discount for blocks of 20 lots. Agents can make good summer commission. So basically, they're advertising this is a color edition where residents can buy houses. And it says, I thought it was really interesting, especially the wording of the advertisement. It says, especially outside of the city limits. And when I was looking at other advertisements, it was also made clear that, this was outside of the city limits, not close to any other white neighborhoods or communities. So as if not to bother anybody. And I want to now, ask you a question. When was the first time you heard about the railroad shop? Because before you go to it, I just want to let people know that eventually this community was forced to move out. Basically, in the middle of the night, people had to grab anything that they could, and basically were forced to move out because the white city officials wanted to take that area in order to make a school for the white children. But I wanted to ask you, when was the first time you heard of the railroad shop?
Well, I'm 65 years old, and I probably heard of it before I was 10.
Yeah.
That's kind of part of what my family is No, we had at least four households of relatives that were evicted from the railroad shop community in the late 1940s. I think like 47, 48. And they ended up, we still have family members that own the homes, or family members own the homes that they moved out of railroad shop into. But yes, it's really part of our family history in terms of my father's family. My father was a teenager at the time, and railroad shop was his neighborhood when he grew up. So from 5 to 17 years old, he lived in railroad shop. So that was his childhood. So that's why I know about it from so long. In fact, the elementary school is named after my great aunt, Lenora Braynon Smith, and another friend of the family, Georgia Jones Ayers, is the name of the middle school that's on the property. So the two schools that are actually on the railroad shop property now were named after individuals who lost their homes in 1947.
Wow. Just by hearing it, you can tell it's such a personal history and such a personal topic. I know that I'm going a little bit over time, and I see the executive director, much more time committed is needed to cover this topic, and I completely agree, because I've been able to find a lot of more interesting information, including how, the fact why this was established, how this was advertised, the fact that, there was a really close, deep-knit community in there. A school was made during that era just for this community, and then it was gone. So what I'm going to do is kind of close out this session. So in the future, I'm going to actually ask you back, if you don't mind, so we can, if we can go back and then just talk about this and dedicate a little bit more time to this subject.
Okay, I look forward to it. Thank you.
Yes, yes. And so basically, I just want to wrap it up saying, is it true that a Black community lived in the area of Brickell? As far as we know, there's no conclusive area, but we do know that there were Black residents living side by side near the Brickell, or working as employees for the Brickells. And back in that era, before City of Miami, before Flagler came, Jim Crow was not as rigid, and basically the early pioneers had to basically depend on each other to basically survive. And before I let you go, I want to ask anybody who's watching if they have any question either for myself or Mr. Braynon. I see a couple of comments. Thank you for watching. And Mr. Braynon, you sent me a lot of cool information, especially the census records and where the Brickells were, and then you can see, where there are also the Black residents who were taking account of the census. And I'm actually going to do a screenshot and post it in our Instagram page, and then also just a picture of some of the people that we were talking about, so people can get a little bit more visuals. But I just want to say thank you so much for coming and joining. And please, I will definitely have you back. I can't wait to talk about the railroad shop when we have more time. And it says, give me 1 second. Let me read some of the comments that are coming in pretty quickly. It says, oh, Mr. Braynon, will you deposit your information? Will you deposit the information that you gather on your family to the Black Archives repository?
Sure.
Yes. And yes, I'm excited for that, because every time I talk to you, Ms. Braynon, I always get so excited, because you guys find such good information that also kind of ties in with other people or other areas that I'm looking into. So I'm so happy that you in the future you're going to deposit the information to the Black Archives.
Well, thank you very much, Joycelyn. I look forward to working with you.
Yes, and I also just want to say thank you for, telling this a little bit more about South Florida's deep-rooted Black history.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Mhm. All right, thank you, Mr. Braynon, and thank you
Bye-bye.
all for joining. Bye.